South Africa's $1 trillion trade shift didn't arrive with a single announcement, a dramatic press conference, or a breaking news headline flashing across American television screens. Instead, it unfolded quietly, deal by deal, shipment by shipment, contract by contract. And that silence is precisely why it has become so powerful. Because while Washington was focused elsewhere, South Africa was reshaping its economic future in ways that are now impossible for the United States to ignore. For decades, South Africa sat at the center of America's Africa strategy. It was the gateway economy, the financial hub, the political anchor. U.S. companies invested heavily. Trade agreements flowed through familiar channels. Diplomatic influence felt secure. The assumption in Washington was simple. South Africa needed the U.S. more than the U.S. needed South Africa. That assumption is now collapsing. South Africa's economy, valued at roughly $1 trillion when trade, finance, and cross-border flows are combined, has entered a new phase. Instead of aligning itself primarily with Western markets, it has begun redirecting trade toward a broader, more diversified network. Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and other African nations are no longer secondary partners. They are becoming central pillars. And this shift is sending shockwaves through U.S. economic and strategic circles. The reason is straightforward. Trade is not just about goods and services. It is about influence. It determines whose standards are adopted, whose currencies are used, whose companies dominate supply chains, and whose political voice carries weight. When a country like South Africa changes where it trades, it changes who holds leverage. For years, U.S. access to South Africa's markets was built on predictability. American firms assumed stable entry. African Growth and Opportunity Act benefits reinforced that confidence. But over time, cracks began to appear. Policy uncertainty in Washington, trade disputes with multiple regions, and shifting global priorities made long-term reliance on the U.S. market feel increasingly risky from Pretoria's perspective. At the same time, South Africa's internal pressures were growing. Unemployment, energy shortages, infrastructure bottlenecks, and rising inequality demanded faster solutions. Waiting for Western capital tied to slow approvals and complex conditions was no longer viable. South Africa needed partners willing to move quickly, invest deeply, and think long-term. That is where the trade shift began. South Africa started prioritizing relationships that offered scale without strings, access without volatility, and investment without political theatrics. This did not mean cutting ties with the United States overnight. It meant something more strategic, reducing dependence. Trade volumes with Asian partners expanded rapidly. China remained a major buyer of minerals and industrial inputs, but the relationship matured beyond raw exports. Processing, manufacturing, and logistics partnerships followed. India emerged as a growing destination for South African goods. Southeast Asian markets opened to agricultural and manufactured products. Meanwhile, intra-African trade gained momentum. The African Continental Free Trade Area changed calculations entirely. South Africa no longer had to look outward first. It could build supply chains within the continent, strengthening regional resilience while capturing value closer to home. For the United States, this was an uncomfortable development. American firms began noticing delays in approvals, tougher negotiations, and competition from companies backed by governments willing to offer financing, infrastructure, and long-term guarantees. The advantage U.S. companies once enjoyed, familiarity, was no longer enough. The most significant impact came in strategic sectors. Mining was first. South Africa sits on some of the world's most critical mineral reserves, essential for modern technology, energy systems, and defense industries. As global demand surged, Pretoria began reassessing who it wanted to rely on for extraction, processing, and export. Instead of shipping raw materials to Western markets, South Africa increasingly pushed for local beneficiation and diversified buyers. Manufacturing followed. South Africa positioned itself as a production hub for both African and global markets. Trade partnerships were structured to support factories, not just exports. This reduced reliance on U.S. consumption and increased ties with regions focused on long-term industrial growth. Agriculture was next. South African food exports once leaned heavily toward Western markets. Now, Middle Eastern and Asian demand is absorbing a growing share. Logistics routes have shifted. Contracts have changed. Risk has been spread. Even finance felt the shift. Trade invoicing currencies diversified. Banking relationships expanded beyond traditional Western institutions. This reduced exposure to U.S. monetary policy shocks and sanctions risk, a lesson many countries have learned in recent years. From Washington's point of view, this was not supposed to happen. South Africa was expected to remain aligned, predictable, and anchored within Western economic systems. Instead, it began acting like a true middle power, one that balances interests rather than chooses sides. The $1 trillion figure matters because it represents scale. South Africa is not a marginal economy making symbolic moves. It is a heavyweight on the continent. When it shifts, others follow. Smaller African economies watch closely. Investors adjust expectations. Global supply chains recalibrate. And that is where the real concern lies for the United States. South Africa's trade decisions influence the broader African market. As Pretoria diversifies, it creates pathways others can use. It normalizes alternatives. It proves that reduced dependence on the U.S. is not only possible, but manageable. This is not anti-American sentiment. It is risk management. South Africa has watched trade disputes escalate globally. It has seen tariffs imposed suddenly. It has observed sanctions reshape entire economies overnight. The lesson is clear. Reliance on any single partner is dangerous. So South Africa chose optionality. In doing so, it exposed a weakness in U.S. strategy. Influence built on assumption is fragile. Influence maintained through engagement is not. American policymakers are now realizing that relationships, once taken for granted, require active maintenance. Preferential access alone is not enough. Lectures are not enough. Pressure is counterproductive. What South Africa wants is respect as an equal partner. That expectation changes everything. When South Africa negotiates today, it does so with confidence. It knows its resources are essential. It knows its market is valuable. It knows its geopolitical position matters. That confidence shows up at the bargaining table. U.S. firms now face tougher demands. Local content requirements. Technology transfer expectations. Longer-term commitments. In some cases, competitors from other regions accept these terms more readily. The result is gradual displacement. Not dramatic. Not hostile. Just effective. For Washington, the realization is sobering. The old model, where access to U.S. markets ensured loyalty, no longer works. The world is more multipolar. Countries like South Africa are navigating it with growing sophistication. This trade shift also carries political implications. As South Africa deepens ties elsewhere, its foreign policy becomes more independent. It votes more freely. It speaks more openly. It resists pressure more confidently. Economic autonomy enables diplomatic autonomy. That does not mean alignment against the U.S. It means alignment with South Africa's interests. And that distinction matters. The shaking of the U.S. is not about lost exports alone. It is about diminished influence in a region that will define global growth for decades. Africa's population, markets, and resources make it unavoidable. Losing ground there is not a short-term issue. It is a generational one. South Africa understands this. That is why it is moving deliberately, not dramatically. It is building redundancy into its trade networks, strength into its partnerships, balance into its diplomacy. For the United States, the question is no longer whether South Africa is shifting. That is already happening. The question is whether Washington can adapt fast enough to remain relevant. Because once trade routes change, they rarely return to their original paths. South Africa's $1 trillion trade shift is not a rejection of the U.S. It is an evolution beyond dependence. And that evolution is reshaping power dynamics in ways that will define the next era of global economics. What we are witnessing is not a break. It is a rebalancing. And in a world where influence follows economics, that rebalancing is shaking the foundations of American assumptions, not with noise, but with quiet, irreversible momentum. The real story is not that South Africa is turning away from the U.S. It is that South Africa is turning toward itself. And that may be the most powerful shift of all. For decades, the United States believed it had Africa figured out. Trade flowed in familiar directions. Influence followed predictable paths. And South Africa, the continent's most industrialized economy, was seen as a stable pillar of Western economic alignment. Washington assumed that relationship was permanent. It wasn't, because while the U.S. was focused on its own internal battles, inflation, elections, trade wars, and global rivalry with China, South Africa was quietly rewriting its economic playbook. No dramatic speeches, no sudden breakups, just deliberate decisions that, taken together, amount to something far bigger than anyone expected. A trade shift worth nearly $1 trillion. That number isn't a headline gimmick. It represents the total gravity of South Africa's economic orbit: exports, imports, investment flows, logistics routes, financial linkages. And that orbit is moving. What makes this moment dangerous for the U.S. isn't the money alone. It's what the money represents: influence, leverage, and long-term control over supply chains that matter more now than at any point in modern history. For years, Washington believed access to American markets was enough to keep partners aligned. Preferential trade programs were treated like anchors. But South Africa learned a hard lesson watching the global economy over the last decade. Access can be revoked, rules can change, and loyalty doesn't guarantee stability. Trade has become political. Tariffs appear overnight. Sanctions expand without warning. Entire industries can be disrupted by decisions made thousands of miles away. South Africa saw this pattern repeat across the world and decided it would not be caught exposed. So it began hedging. At first, the changes were subtle. New trade agreements here, expanded partnerships there, a little less dependence on one market, a little more engagement with another. But momentum builds quickly when the logic is sound. And the logic was undeniable. South Africa sits on resources the world desperately needs: critical minerals, industrial metals, agricultural capacity, energy potential. Add to that advanced financial systems, manufacturing capability, and regional leadership, and suddenly South Africa isn't a junior partner anymore. It's a gatekeeper. That realization changed the tone of negotiations. South Africa stopped asking what it could get from the U.S. and started asking what it was risking by relying too heavily on it. And once that question was asked, the answer was unavoidable. Dependence is vulnerability. So Pretoria began shifting trade flows toward partners that offered stability, long-term investment, and respect for sovereignty. Asia, the Middle East, other African nations, even emerging middle powers that preferred cooperation over pressure. None of this was framed as anti-American. That's the mistake many analysts make. This isn't about ideology. It's about survival in a volatile global economy. But from Washington's perspective, the impact feels the same. U.S. firms are facing stiffer competition. American negotiators are encountering firmer resistance. Deals that once moved smoothly now stall or collapse. Influence that once felt automatic now has to be earned. And that's unsettling. Because when a country like South Africa shifts, it doesn't shift alone. Others watch. Others learn. Others follow. Africa is no longer a collection of isolated markets. Regional integration is accelerating. Trade corridors are forming. Supply chains are linking. What South Africa normalizes today becomes an option for the rest of the continent tomorrow. That's why this trade shift matters far beyond Pretoria. The U.S. understands power in terms of systems. And trade is one of the most powerful systems of all. When trade routes change, influence follows. When influence fades, geopolitical leverage weakens. This isn't happening through confrontation. It's happening through choice. South Africa is choosing flexibility over loyalty, balance over alignment, optionality over dependence. And those choices are shaking assumptions that have shaped U.S. Africa relations for decades. The most uncomfortable truth for Washington is this: South Africa didn't need permission to do this. It didn't need approval. It didn't need validation. It simply acted in its own interest, the same way powerful nations always have. That's what makes this moment different. Africa is no longer waiting for signals. It is sending them. The $1 trillion trade shift is one of those signals. Quiet, calculated, irreversible. And as it unfolds, one question hangs in the air, unanswered but unavoidable. If South Africa no longer centers its economic future around the United States, what happens to America's influence in Africa next? That's the story behind the numbers. And it's only just beginning.